Welcome back, everyone, to The Deep Dive. Ready to go beyond just skimming the surface?
Always.
Good, because today we're diving deep, really deep into a topic that's been generating a lot of conversation and debate recently, reparations for ancestral justice.
Yeah,
And for this deep dive, we're going to be focusing on a single source, but it's a really comprehensive one, the Black experience in America.
a powerful book. You know, it really lays out the entire historical narrative, starting from African origins and moving all the way to the present day. It offers a really vivid picture of the contributions and challenges faced by foundational Black Americans.
It's incredible how much ground this book covers. And it starts by, shattering some common misconceptions. Like right off the bat, the section on early African civilizations really caught my eye. I mean, we often hear about ancient Egypt, but these weren't just simple societies.
No, not at all. The book highlights how advanced these civilizations truly were. Like, think about Kush, for example, or the Mali Empire. These were societies with sophisticated systems of governance and trade networks and innovation. They had thriving economies, sophisticated architecture, and, really rich cultural traditions.
It's amazing to think about, when we talk about ancestral justice, it's really important to remember that these early African societies weren't starting from scratch. They had this whole legacy of achievement that was, brutally disrupted.
Absolutely. And that's a crucial point. The transatlantic slave trade, it didn't just displace people. It tore apart entire civilizations and, severed connections to history and culture and knowledge. And the Black experience in America, it really drives home the magnitude of that loss.
It really does. And, the book doesn't shy away from the just horrific details of the slave trade itself. The Middle Passage in particular, the conditions on those ships, as the book describes them, were absolutely inhumane.
It's hard to even fathom. One of the most jarring statistics that I came across was that during the Middle Passage, it's estimated that something like 1 in 5 Africans died en route to the Americas. Just imagine the sheer scale of suffering and loss.
That's a staggering number. It's a stark reminder of the human cost of this entire system.
Yeah.
And even for those who survived that journey, their ordeal was far from over. The book talks about this seasoning process where newly arrived Africans were just subjected to further brutality and dehumanization. Just awful.
It was the seasoning process. It was this calculated attempt to break their spirits, erase their identities and their cultures, and force them into submission. It's just a chilling example of how the system of slavery was designed to just strip people of their humanity.
And that system, as the book points out, was particularly brutal here in North America. Even compared to other slaveholding societies, the conditions here were exceptionally harsh.
You're absolutely right. The book draws a really stark contrast between slavery in North America and in other parts of the world, like South America, for instance. In many South American colonies, enslaved people actually had some limited legal protections, and there was a possibility of manumission or, gaining their freedom. But in North America, enslaved people were seen purely as property with basically no rights.
It's just a completely different level of dehumanization.
Yeah.
And that legacy, it continues to cast a long shadow, doesn't it?
It does. The book makes the argument that you can't understand the ongoing struggle for racial justice in America today without understanding the deep and lasting wounds of slavery.
And it's not just about the physical and emotional trauma. It's also about, the economic exploitation that was at the very heart of the system. And I think this is where the argument for reparations really starts to take shape.
Absolutely. The Black experience in America makes a really compelling case for reparations as a form of acknowledgement and redress for the economic injustices that stemmed directly from slavery. It highlights how, the forced labor of enslaved Africans generated immense wealth for white Americans, while simultaneously denying Black Americans the opportunity to build wealth and any economic security for themselves or for their descendants.
It's like this double injustice. It's not only were Black Americans subjected to centuries of forced labor and oppression, but they were also systematically excluded from the very systems that allowed others to prosper.
Yeah, it's a key point. And it's not just about the past either. The book argues that these historical injustices continue to have real-world consequences today, shaping things like income inequality, access to education, healthcare, even life expectancy.
So when we talk about ancestral justice, it's not just about righting the wrongs of the past. It's about addressing these ongoing disparities that are so deeply rooted in that past.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that the legacy of slavery and systemic racism, it continues to create barriers for Black Americans today. And reparations in this context become a way to address those barriers and, try to create a more equitable future.
It's a really powerful argument. Now, the book goes on to detail the period of Reconstruction after the Civil War. And for a brief time, it seemed like things were finally starting to change, for the better. Black Americans gained political representation, there was this push for land redistribution, and education became more accessible.
Reconstruction represented, I think, a brief but really significant period of progress. But it was met with, fierce resistance from those who were determined to maintain the old power structures.
And that resistance, tragically, it ultimately prevailed. The Black experience in America describes how the promise of Reconstruction was systematically dismantled through violence, intimidation, and, the rise of Jim Crow laws.
Yeah. The era of Jim Crow was really a deliberate attempt to reassert white supremacy and solidify this system of racial segregation and inequality. It was a devastating blow to the progress that had been made during Reconstruction.
And again, it's not just about the past. The legacy of Jim Crow is still felt today, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Things like discriminatory housing policies, mass incarceration, and, the persistent racial wealth gap.
Yeah, it's undeniable.
It's clear that the fight for racial justice in America has been, this long and arduous journey, marked by both moments of hope and periods of really profound setback.
And yet, amidst all of this, the book also highlights this incredible resilience and strength of the Black community. There's a whole section on the Great Migration where, millions of Black Americans left the South in search of better opportunities in the North and the West.
What a powerful story of, courage and determination. And it's during this time that we see the rise of figures like W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. And the book delves into their contrasting philosophies, how to achieve racial justice.
Yeah, Du Bois was a proponent of integration. He believed that Black Americans should strive for full equality within American society. Garvey, on the other hand, advocated for Black nationalism and, a return to Africa. So two very different approaches.
But both reflecting this deep desire for, liberation and self-determination.
Right. And both, contributing to this ongoing conversation about what it means to be Black in America, a conversation that continues to this day.
And it's just fascinating to see how these different strands of thought have shaped the Black experience. But, before we move on, I do want to touch on one more key event from this period, the Harlem Renaissance.
Oh, the Harlem Renaissance. This was a period of just incredible artistic and cultural flourishing in Harlem, New York. Just the celebration of Black identity, creativity, and resilience.
I mean, the book describes it as like this moment of radical self-expression and a challenge to, the prevailing racist stereotypes of the time.
Absolutely. From literature and music to visual art and dance, the Harlem Renaissance showcased the brilliance and the diversity of Black talent. Figures like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Duke Ellington, they became icons not just within the Black community, but, on the national stage.
So even in the face of, oppression and discrimination, Black Americans were creating art, building communities, and challenging the status quo.
That's a theme that runs throughout, the Black experience in America. It's a story of resilience, resistance, and, this ongoing pursuit of justice.
And that pursuit of justice brings us right back to the concept of reparations.
Yeah. The book makes a really compelling case for reparations, not just as a way to address past wrongs, but as a, necessary step towards creating a more just and equitable future for all Americans.
And, we've covered a lot of ground already, but we're just getting started. When we come back, we'll continue our exploration of the Black experience in America, and we'll delve even deeper into the complexities of reparations for ancestral justice.
One of the things that really struck me while I was reading this book was how it delves into the psychological and emotional toll of racism. Like, it's not just about these historical events, right? It's about the actual lived experiences of Black Americans.
Yeah, and the book doesn't shy away from exploring all the different ways that, Black Americans have coped with that trauma and stress.
Exactly. And it even goes so far as to categorize these coping mechanisms and analyze, how effective they've been.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me an example. What kind of coping mechanisms are we talking about here?
Yeah.
Well, one approach that the book talks about is what they call emotion-focused coping. This could involve things like, leaning on faith and spirituality, finding humor in really difficult situations, or seeking support within, the Black community. It's about finding ways to sort of process and manage that emotional pain that racism inflicts.
So it's like creating a sense of resilience and strength from within, almost like building a shield against all that negativity.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And then there's what they call problem-focused coping, which is more about taking direct action. This could involve things like activism, speaking out against injustice, or, working to create change within institutions.
So it's about channeling that anger and frustration into something constructive, something that can actually make a difference.
Right. And the book actually explores, how effective these different approaches are. For example, while avoidance might offer, some temporary relief, it can actually be detrimental in the long run, leading to feelings of powerlessness.
It's like trying to outrun your shadow.
Yeah.
You can't really escape it. You have to confront it at some point.
Exactly. And that's where the book's insights are so valuable, I think. It highlights the importance of finding coping mechanisms that are, both empowering and sustainable.
It's about resilience, but it's also about agency, right? It's about reclaiming your own power in a system that's, designed to take it away.
You've hit the nail on the head, and that idea of reclaiming power is a recurring theme in this book, especially when it, starts talking about the civil rights movement.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
You can't talk about the Black experience in America without talking about the civil rights movement. I mean, it was such a pivotal moment in our history.
I agree. The book really captures the energy and determination of that era. The courage of figures like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr., and the power of nonviolent resistance, those massive protests and marches. I mean, it was a period of just incredible upheaval and change.
And the book doesn't just recount, the historical events. It also analyzes the strategies and philosophies that drove the movement.
And one thing that really stood out to me was the emphasis on nonviolent resistance. It was a deliberate choice, a way to challenge the system without, resorting to violence.
And it was incredibly effective. The book points to all of the landmark legislation that was passed as a direct result of the Civil Rights Movement.
Things like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, right? I mean, those were major victories.
Huge. But the book also acknowledges that the fight for racial justice didn't end with, those legislative victories.
No, absolutely not. The legacy of the civil rights movement is complex. It definitely brought about significant change, but it also left a lot of issues unresolved.
Like the persistence of systemic racism, for example.
Exactly. The book argues that while legal segregation was dismantled, systemic racism still continues to permeate many aspects of American society, from housing and education to, the criminal justice system.
And this brings us right back to this conversation around reparations. The book makes this really powerful case that reparations aren't just about addressing past wrongs. They're about dismantling these ongoing systems of inequality that are, so deeply rooted in that past.
That's such a key insight. It's about recognizing that the fight for racial justice, it's an ongoing process, not a one-time event. And reparations are very much a part of that process.
It's about acknowledging that the playing field is, still tilted. And true equality, it requires more than just legal protections, right? It requires this fundamental shift in how we as a society think about race and power.
And the book doesn't shy away from exploring all the different forms that reparations could take. It goes beyond just direct financial payments. It considers things like community investments, educational initiatives, and, even land redistribution.
It's about finding these creative and meaningful ways to repair the damage that has been done and create, a more equitable future.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another key theme in the book, the Black Power movement. This movement emerged, in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement, and it had this really distinct focus on Black self-determination and empowerment.
Right. The book talks about figures like Stokely Carmichael and Malcolm X, who really challenged that, integrationist approach of earlier civil rights leaders. And they advocated for this more, radical vision of Black liberation.
Yeah, they emphasized Black pride, self-reliance, and community control. And their message, it resonated really deeply with many Black Americans who felt that the civil rights movement hadn't gone far enough in addressing the systemic inequalities they faced.
It was about reclaiming their own narrative, their own identity, and their own power.
Exactly. And that message, it continues to resonate even today. The demands of the Black Power movement for economic empowerment, control over Black institutions, an end to police brutality, they're echoed in many of the movements that we see today.
It's this reminder that the fight for racial justice is a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah.
Right? And it requires this constant vigilance and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
And this conversation reminds me of another powerful concept that the book explores, ancestral justice.
Oh, yeah. That's a concept that really resonated with me, too. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Well, it's about recognizing that the harms of slavery and systemic racism, they extend beyond just individual experiences. They impact entire lineages, communities, and cultures.
It's about acknowledging that the past isn't really just the past. Like, it lives on in the present. And it continues to shape the lives of Black Americans today.
Exactly. And reparations, from an ancestral justice perspective, they aren't just about making amends for those past wrongs. They're about actually repairing the ongoing damage that's being done to Black communities as a result of those past wrongs.
It's about breaking that cycle of poverty and inequality that's been perpetuated for generations.
Precisely. And the book actually delves into some really specific examples of how this concept of ancestral justice could be applied in the context of reparations.
Oh, interesting. Can you share some of those examples? I'm curious to hear, how this would play out in a more practical sense. I think, a lot of people struggle to really grasp what ancestral justice looks like in, real life. It's such a powerful concept, but it can feel a bit abstract.
It definitely is a concept that requires some unpacking. One way to think about it is through the lens of the racial wealth gap. The book points out that the median wealth of white families in America is significantly higher than that of Black families.
And that gap isn't, just some random occurrence, right? It's directly tied to those historical injustices.
Exactly. The book traces that disparity back to things like slavery and Jim Crow laws and, discriminatory housing policies like redlining and the systemic exclusion of Black Americans from opportunities to build wealth.
So when we talk about ancestral justice, we're talking about acknowledging that historical context and actually taking steps to correct that imbalance.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that the economic disadvantages faced by many Black families today, they aren't just a result of individual choices or circumstances, right? They are, at least in part, a consequence of this system that has historically denied Black Americans equal opportunities.
It's like starting a race with a weighted ankle bracelet, right? You might be able to run, but you're not going to have a fair shot at winning.
That's a great analogy. And reparations, from this ancestral justice perspective, are about removing those weights, about leveling the playing field so that everyone has a fair chance to succeed.
It's about creating a future where success isn't predetermined by, the color of your skin or the circumstances of your birth.
Exactly. The book explores all sorts of different models for how reparations could be implemented, but, the underlying principle is the same: to address that ongoing harm that's caused by these historical injustices and create a more equitable society.
Now, I know, the conversation around reparations can get pretty heated. There are people who just flat out argue that, it's impossible to make amends for something that happened so long ago.
It's a common argument, but the book challenges that notion, It points out that the effects of slavery and systemic racism, they aren't just confined to the past. They actually continue to shape the present in very tangible ways.
It's not about punishing people today, right?
Yeah.
For the sins of their ancestors. It's about recognizing that those sins have created this ripple effect. And it's still being felt today.
It's about taking responsibility for that ripple effect, for acknowledging that the past isn't truly in the past until we address, the ongoing injustices that it has created.
And, the book also addresses the concern that reparations would be divisive, that they would create resentment among different racial groups.
It's true. Some people might view reparations as the zero-sum game, as if one group's gain necessarily comes at the expense of another. But the Black experience in America frames it differently. It argues that reparations aren't about pitting one group against another. They're about healing the wounds of the past and creating, a more just and equitable society for everyone.
It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected, that, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
That's a really powerful way to think about it. It's not about, taking something away from one group to give it to another. It's about creating a society where everyone actually has the opportunity to thrive.
And that's the ultimate goal of ancestral justice, right? It's to create a future where that legacy of oppression and inequality is finally broken. A future where everyone has a chance to reach their full potential, regardless of, their race or background.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, this deep dive has been incredibly insightful. I mean, the Black experience in America has really challenged my thinking and broadened my understanding of, just how complex this issue is.
I agree. It's a book that everyone should read, honestly. It's a powerful testament to the resilience of the Black community and just this compelling call to action for all of us to, really work towards a more just and equitable future.
And for our listeners, I really encourage you to seek out the Black experience in America and, continue exploring this whole conversation around reparations for ancestral justice. It's a conversation that's long overdue, and it's one that we all need to be a part of.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for listening to the FBA Stoic Podcast. We'll see you next time.